What made you feel rich or not that poor anymore? Story 1. There was a time when I had to meticulously plan every grocery trip, right down to the exact cent. I'd follow my wife around the store, clutching a calculator and flipping through an envelope stuffed with coupons, praying we didn't exceed our $50 weekly budget. I remember double coupon days were like hitting the jackpot. Now, fast forward 30 years, and our grocery trips look nothing like that. We still shop smart. Most of it's from Aldi, and we plan meals carefully. But before we check out, we play this little game where we guess the total. Sometimes it's higher than we think, sometimes lower. But the best part? It doesn't matter. There's no heart-stopping panic at the register anymore. No second-guessing every item. Just an easy, lighthearted moment that reminds me how far we've come from those tight, stress-filled days. Story 2. The first time I realized I could buy something purely because I wanted it, not because I needed it, was an emotional moment for me. Back in college, and even for a few years after, I lived in a world where every purchase had to have a purpose. Groceries, gas, bills, that was it. The idea of spending on a whim felt irresponsible, almost reckless. Then, one day, after getting my first big promotion at 26, I decided to splurge. I booked an appointment at a high-end salon, a place I'd only ever seen in magazines. I remember sitting in that chair, still grappling with guilt, wondering if I'd made a mistake. My fiancé reassured me, "You worked hard for this. Celebrate it." And he was right. That haircut wasn't just about looking good. It was about letting go of the constant pressure to justify every dollar. I didn't feel poor anymore. Story 3. It wasn't the big milestones that made me feel less poor. It was something as small as not panicking when payday was a week away. I used to live paycheck to paycheck, always counting the days and watching my balance drop closer to zero as each one passed. If I ever checked my account and found more than I expected, it felt like I'd won the lottery. One month, though, it finally happened. I got to the end of the pay period, checked my balance, and realized I had enough left over to not only cover the basics, but start saving. That moment shifted my entire perspective. For the first time, I wasn't surviving. I was living. Story 4. Growing up, shopping at the fancy grocery store felt like stepping into another world. My mom and I would occasionally go when she needed something special, and I'd wander the aisles in awe, imagining what it would be like to shop there all the time. Back then, we stuck to farm stands and food banks, sometimes having to make meals stretch impossibly far. The calculation wasn't about nutrition, it was calories per penny. Fast forward to today, and I found myself in a similar store, just casually picking up some miso and fresh sausage for dinner. I didn't even flinch when I tossed a fancy pasta into the cart. The weight of financial stress that had followed me for so long was gone. Standing there in that bright, spotless store, I teared up, not out of sadness but gratitude. I finally had the freedom to enjoy life's little luxuries. Story 5. For years, getting gas was an exercise in careful budgeting. I'd pull up to the pump, already knowing I could only afford $10 or $20 worth, just enough to get me through the week. I'd watch the meter climb, praying I didn't accidentally overfill and overdraft my account. But now I pull in, swipe my card, and don't even glance at the total. The first time I filled up a full tank without thinking about it, I sat in my car and just smiled. It wasn't about the gas. It was the relief of knowing I wasn't living on the edge anymore. Story 6. I still remember the day I stopped counting down to payday. For most of my life, every day was a mental calculation. How much I had left, what bills were coming up, and whether I could make it without dipping into overdraft. Checking my balance felt like bracing for bad news, and I'd get this sinking feeling whenever I saw how little was left. But one day, a weird thing happened. I forgot payday was even coming. A few days before, I logged into my account expecting the usual stress. But there was more money there than I'd ever seen at this point in the month. I double-checked, thinking maybe something hadn't cleared. But no, it was real. For the first time, I wasn't just scraping by. I'd built up enough of a cushion that I didn't have to time my spending to the hour anymore. It was such a small moment, but it meant everything. For the first time, I felt like I was actually in control of my life. Story 7. It sounds ridiculous, but the first time I bought 3-ply toilet paper, I felt like I made it. Growing up, we always bought the cheapest of everything, and toiletries were no exception. Single-ply was our go-to, and I got used to it. In college, even as I started earning a little on the side, I'd still grab the bargain stuff out of habit, or maybe fear that I'd suddenly run out of money if I didn't. Then one day, I was standing in the aisle, looking at the cheap stuff and thought, why not? It was such a simple choice, but it felt luxurious, almost rebellious. I tossed the softest, most expensive roll into my cart like it was nothing. Later, sitting in my little apartment, I realized it wasn't really about the toilet paper. It was about finally giving myself permission to live a little. Now I laugh at how something so small could mean so much. But to this day, 3-ply still feels like a little celebration. Story 8. I didn't know what it meant to not be poor anymore until the day I could buy a new tire without panicking. A few years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. If something went wrong, car trouble, a surprise medical bill, anything, I'd spiral into full-blown anxiety. I'd have to shuffle money between accounts, maybe borrow from family, and pray I didn't hit my credit limit. But one day while driving home, I hit debris on the freeway and my tire was shredded. I pulled into a shop and they gave me the quote for a replacement. Normally that's when my chest would tighten, but this time I just said, "Okay, go ahead. No math, no calling anyone for help." I paid and walked out feeling a weird sense of pride. Driving away on that new tire, I realized it wasn't about the money. It was about knowing that I had built a buffer, that I could handle life's curveballs without falling apart. That's when I finally felt free. Story 9. For years, my husband and I played a game at the grocery store, but it wasn't fun. We'd walk through the aisles with a calculator, adding every item and trying to avoid the shame of having to put something back at checkout. Coupons were our lifeline, and even then there were nights we'd eat the bare minimum just to make it to the next week. But now, things are different. We still stick to a shopping list. Old habits die hard. But the game has changed. Instead of stressing over every penny, we guess the total for fun. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But here's the crazy part. We don't care. The number doesn't define our choices anymore. I'll never forget the first time we saw a slightly higher total and just shrugged it off. It was a moment of quiet triumph. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor anymore. Story 10. There's this moment I keep coming back to, one that hits me every time I open my fridge. It's full. Not just with leftovers or the bare essentials, but snacks, drinks, and ingredients I actually want. Growing up, a stocked fridge was something other people had. My mom worked hard, but there were weeks we had to stretch every meal. Ramen, boxed mac and cheese, and whatever was on sale became our staples. I learned to eat fast so I didn't think about still being hungry. But now, I open my fridge, and it's like a different world. There's variety, fresh vegetables, good coffee creamer, even the fancy cheese I used to walk past with envy. It might sound silly, but standing there, seeing all those little luxuries, feels like the most powerful reminder of how far I've come. It's not about being rich. It's about not being scared anymore. Story 11. Growing up, Christmas wasn't a season of joy for me. It was a season of hoping. Every year, my siblings and I would make wish lists, knowing full well that most of what we wrote down wouldn't be under the tree. My parents tried their best, but money was always tight. Sometimes we'd get lucky and have a good Christmas when my dad picked up extra shifts, but more often than not, we'd open presents that were practical: socks, gloves, and maybe a toy or two from the clearance rack. As a kid, I didn't fully understand how hard my parents were working just to make those small moments happen. When I got older, Christmas didn't change much. I'd scrape together whatever I could to buy gifts for family and friends, always stressing about how much it was costing me. One year, I had to put half my presents on a credit card and spent months paying them off. But last year, something shifted. I'd been working a better-paying job for a while, and for the first time, I had a little extra money, enough that I didn't have to worry about the cost of Christmas. I went all out. I got my mom the stand mixer she'd been dreaming of for years, the kind with all the attachments and a sleek silver finish. For my dad, I found a set of tools that he'd been eyeing but never bought for himself. And for my cousin's kid, a kid who's always so kind and thoughtful, I picked up a limited edition Xbox controller. It was the first time in my life that I didn't have to settle for good enough. I could actually give the people I love the things they wanted. On Christmas morning, as I watched everyone open their gifts, I felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude. It wasn't just about the presents. It was about the freedom to give without sacrificing my own stability. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was barely scraping by. I felt secure, generous, and, dare I say it, rich in a way that really mattered. Story 12. I used to think about money constantly, how much I had, how much I needed, and how much I could get away with spending before everything collapsed. I couldn't even enjoy the little things. Groceries became an elaborate mental calculation, a constant balancing act between do I need it and can I afford it? But one day I caught myself doing something strange, walking through the aisles of the store, grabbing what I wanted without checking the price. I stopped, almost confused by my own behavior. At the checkout, I realized I hadn't even glanced at my bank balance before swiping my card. When I got home, I sat down and thought about it. It wasn't that I suddenly had millions in the bank. I'd just reached this point where I trusted that I'd be okay, that I wouldn't have to skip meals or juggle bills. That moment changed everything. It wasn't about the money itself, but the freedom that came with knowing I'd finally escaped survival mode. Story 13. For most of my life, payday was a lifeline. I'd count down the days, holding my breath as my bank balance edged closer to zero. Every dollar spent felt like gambling. If something unexpected came up, I'd be screwed. Then one day, everything shifted. I was scrolling through my account, bracing for the usual low balance warning, but there was more money than I expected. I actually thought I'd made a mistake. I checked my upcoming bills, double-checked my paycheck, and still, it was real. That month I got to the next payday with money left over. Not much, but enough to make me realize I was finally breaking free of the cycle. Now, I don't count the days anymore. I've learned to trust that I'll be okay, and that simple shift has made me feel richer than I ever thought possible. Story 14. Gas stations used to be one of my biggest sources of anxiety. I'd pull up to the pump knowing I didn't have enough to fill the tank, and try to figure out exactly how much I could afford. $10 here, $15 there, just enough to get me through the week. Every time I swiped my card, I'd hold my breath, hoping it wouldn't get declined. And the few times it did, the embarrassment was almost unbearable. I'd drive away feeling ashamed and defeated, knowing I'd have to scrape together the cash somehow just to keep my car running. But one night everything changed. I was driving home from work late and my fuel light came on. Normally this would have been the start of a spiral, figuring out which bill I could delay, whether I had enough on my credit card, or if I'd have to borrow money. But this time, something was different. I stopped at the nearest gas station, walked up to the pump, and started filling the tank. I didn't check my balance first, didn't do the mental math to see if I could afford it. I just filled it. As the numbers on the pump climbed higher than they ever had before, I felt this strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, disbelief. I realized I wasn't worried about the total because I knew I could cover it. I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck anymore. I had enough money to handle something as simple as filling up my car, and that alone felt like a luxury. Driving home that night, I kept thinking about how many years I'd spent stressing over every dollar, living in constant fear of the unexpected. It wasn't about the gas. It was about what it symbolized. For the first time, I wasn't living in survival mode. I could handle life's little emergencies without falling apart, and that made me feel richer than I ever had before. Story 15. I'll never forget the day I walked into a Whole Foods and didn't feel like an outsider. Growing up, we couldn't even afford the regular grocery store most weeks. My mom and I would go to farm stands and, when times were tough, food banks. I used to watch her do mental gymnastics just to make meals work for the week. When I was older and started shopping for myself, I'd stick to the cheapest calories I could find. ramen, rice, and frozen veggies. But years later, after getting a better job, I found myself in Whole Foods. I'd gone in just to browse, not expecting to buy much, but then I saw all the things I'd dreamed about as a kid. Fresh seafood, handmade pasta, spices I couldn't even pronounce. And this time, I didn't have to calculate how much I could spend. I filled my cart, knowing I'd be fine. When I got home and unpacked those groceries, I cried. Not out of sadness, but because I'd finally made it to a place where food wasn't a source of anxiety anymore. Story 16. For years, gas was my enemy. Every trip to the pump came with a pit in my stomach as I carefully watched the numbers tick up, praying they wouldn't go too high. I couldn't afford a full tank, not even close, so I'd put in $10 here, $15 there, and hope it would last until payday. One night, driving home late, my fuel light came on and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stopped, swiped my card, and something wild happened. I filled the tank. The meter kept going, past the point where I would have normally stopped, and I didn't panic. It wasn't until I got back in my car and started driving that it hit me. I didn't have to stress about it. I had enough money that filling up didn't feel like an emergency. It was such a small thing, but sitting there on that quiet highway, it felt like freedom. Story 17. I never thought I'd cry in a grocery store, but it happened. Growing up, my mom and I lived through some rough times. Food was never guaranteed. We'd hit up local farm stands for deals, food banks when things got really tight. And on the rare occasions we went to the grocery store, it was all about finding the cheapest calories we could. I got used to eating a lot of rice, ramen, and frozen vegetables, things that filled us up without costing much. I remember walking past the deli counter or bakery, seeing the fresh bread or ready-to-eat meals, and wondering what it would be like to just toss those into the cart without worrying about the price. Fast forward to last year, when my husband and I decided to check out a new fancy grocery store that had opened up nearby. It was one of those places with bright, clean aisles and specialty foods everywhere. At first, I walked around in awe, just like I did as a kid when we'd go to Whole Foods once or twice a year for a special ingredient. Only this time, something was different. As I moved through the store, I found myself picking things up without thinking twice. Fresh ground sausage, organic produce, a bag of artisan pasta. I even grabbed a block of cheese that cost more than I used to spend on an entire week of groceries. Then I wandered into the pasta aisle. It was huge, with rows of different shapes, brands, and flavors I'd never seen before. I spotted a bag of handmade pappardelle, the kind that's pale and a little dusty from being air-dried. And that's when it hit me. I could buy this. I didn't have to calculate what percentage of my budget it would take or figure out what I'd have to sacrifice to afford it. I could just put it in my cart and enjoy it. That realization was so overwhelming I started crying right there in the aisle. When my husband found me, he was confused at first. "What's wrong?" he asked. And all I could manage to say was, "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." That grocery trip was a turning point for me. It wasn't about being able to shop at a fancy store. It was about knowing I'd left behind the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't just feeding myself anymore. I was thriving. Story 18. Growing up, Christmas wasn't about giving. It was about hoping. I'd make my little wish list, knowing deep down that my parents couldn't afford most of what was on it. Even as an adult, my holiday budget was a stretch. But last year, everything was different. I walked into a store with one goal: to spoil the people I love. I got my mom the fancy mixer she'd been eyeing for years, grabbed a stack of books for my dad, and even picked up a limited edition Xbox controller for my cousin's kid. I didn't hesitate, didn't do the mental math to see if I could afford it. I just bought what I knew would make them smile. On Christmas morning, watching their faces light up, I realized how far I'd come. The joy wasn't in what I got, but in what I could give. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel poor. I felt rich in the ways that mattered most. Story 19. When I was younger, the concept of fun money didn't exist. Every cent had a purpose. Every dollar was pre-spent in my mind before it ever hit my bank account. Groceries were calculated down to the cent, Gas was pumped in the smallest increments, and anything that didn't contribute directly to survival was out of the question. But then one day, I got a promotion. A real one, with a salary bump that didn't just cover my bills, but left a little room for extras. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. My instinct was to hoard it, keep it for emergencies. But my fiancé, now my husband, convinced me otherwise. "Celebrate," he said. "You earned this." So I booked an appointment at a high-end salon. I walked in nervous, trying to justify the splurge in my head, but by the time I walked out, I felt like a new person. It wasn't just about the haircut, it was about what it represented. I didn't have to feel guilty about treating myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Story 20. The first time I realized I wasn't poor anymore was at a tire shop. I'd hit a chunk of debris on the freeway, and my tire was completely ruined. In the past, this kind of situation would have thrown my entire life into chaos. I'd have called my bank to see if I could afford the repair, maybe asked to split the payment across 2 cards, or begged the shop to let me pay half now and half later. But this time, it was different. I pulled into the shop, got the quote, and just said, "Okay." No panic, no juggling, no second-guessing. As I sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone, I had this moment of clarity. It wasn't just about having the money, it was about the freedom it gave me. I could handle life's surprises without falling apart. Driving away on that new tire, I felt lighter than I had in years. Story 21. Growing up, grocery shopping was a game of survival. My mom and I would go in with a strict budget, armed with coupons and a calculator, and we'd agonize over every item. I remember her putting things back on the shelf, muttering under her breath, "Next time." It was hard to watch, but it taught me the value of money. Years later, after I got married, my husband and I carried those same habits into our own grocery trips. We stuck to a list, shopped at budget stores, and played it safe. But slowly, things started to change. Promotions came, raises followed, and one day we realized we didn't have to count every dollar anymore. Now we still shop smart, it's in our DNA, but the stress is gone. We guess the total at checkout just for fun, and whether it's higher or lower, it doesn't faze us. The freedom to shop without fear feels like a luxury I'll never take for granted. Story 22. I'll never forget the first time I bought something just because I wanted it. I was 26, fresh off a big promotion, and for the first time in my life, I had a little extra money to play with. But instead of feeling excited, I felt paralyzed. Every time I thought about spending it on something non-essential, I'd hear this voice in my head telling me to save it for an emergency. Finally, my fiancé convinced me to do something for myself. So I booked an appointment at this fancy salon I'd always wanted to try. Sitting in the chair, I was still second-guessing myself. But when I saw the finished look, I felt a wave of pride. I'd worked hard, and I deserved this. That haircut wasn't just a splurge, it was a moment of realization. I didn't have to feel guilty about living a little. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my life, and it was a feeling I never wanted to let go of. Story 23. There was a time when gas stations gave me anxiety. I'd pull up, knowing exactly how much I could afford. $10, maybe $15 if I stretched my grocery budget, and I'd pump just enough to get me through the week. I couldn't even look at the meter as it ticked upward, afraid it might go over and overdraft my account. But one night, everything changed. I was driving home late, and my fuel light came on. Normally I'd panic, but this time I didn't. I stopped at the nearest station, swiped my card, and filled the tank completely. As I stood there watching the numbers climb, I realized I wasn't stressed. I wasn't counting pennies in my head or wondering how I'd make it to payday. It was just gas, no big deal. Driving away, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't about being rich, it was about knowing I'd finally built a life where I didn't have to choose between filling my tank and eating dinner.